In this book overview, I'm talking about A Pattern of Islands by author Arthur Grimble, who actually I should say is Sir Arthur Grimble for his service. And I want to talk about the big idea, but also kind of breaking that down, because with this book, with an autobiography, talking about the time he spent in what is now Kiribati in the South Pacific, there isn't so much one big idea, although if I had to wrap it up, I would just say the big idea is sharing what he learned about the people and the way of life at the time he was there, and then a little bit about what his life was like as well, being an administrator for the English government. So, like I just said, it's a look at this, but it's during the early 1900s. I believe he joined the colonial service in 1914 as a cadet and was posted to what was then called the Gilbert and I suppose it's called Ellice Islands. I haven't heard it pronounced, but it's spelled Ellice, which is now the nation of Kiribati. And he was in there in various positions until I believe it was 1933 and stayed involved for a long time. He passed away, I believe, in 1956. And so really interesting look at this. And like I said, he's an English administrator cadet. I believe he ended up being, I was looking through the notes, but I forget the name. They have a name for like the top administrator, like a district administrator. But by all accounts, not just his own, but from third-party accounts, he was truly there to understand the people, to learn from them, and to help them and to learn. And in the book, too, he talks about this, how it was so unfortunate that, especially on the religious side of things, over time, things had been done where maybe missionaries had come in and taken such a I think the understatement is a strong stance against the native religion and maybe their worship of the deceased, keeping skulls, things like that, as a way to communicate with their ancestors, and that if they would have taken a different approach, it really could have strengthened the religion, and instead of kind of destroying their past and all the negative effects that had. I think that was really sad to read, and it clearly pained him, upon realizing how things had been done. So some fascinating insights on this, the traditions. I mentioned one about the ancestor worship I wasn't familiar with. A lot of this for me was eye-opening. I don't know a whole lot about, South Pacific and the religions that they had, the native traditions, things like that. I've done some reading over the years on some various areas here and there, a little bit of, maybe how Polynesian people spread throughout the islands, things like that. But to really dive into this and to get some information and, what was still alive culturally in the early 1900s was, to me, fascinating. It's a world that I'm not familiar with. So I think that that's a good note for anyone interested in this. There are some really fascinating insights, a couple of which I will talk about. The daily life, I believe I have some offshoots of this. So Arthur the author was adopted by a local, I forget if it was the clan, I believe it was, and I don't want to spoil all of this, but how they break things down, the native people who live there, but he becomes a part of the society through adoption, which is something that was done. And it describes how that all works, and it's really interesting. A big part of what he did is resolving issues, solving problems, right, as an administrator, besides, overseeing things like health and maybe some building projects, but resolving issues and how he has to deal with that. The good, the bad, the ugly, some really funny stories. There's some really good ones there. And of course, anytime you have, different cultures interacting, it's nice when you can see a healthy, positive outcome to some funny situations, which in other cases have, didn't turn out well. So it's nice in this book to see that, he was able to work with people and to have, for the most part, good resolutions. One of the stories that really stuck with me involved hunting. And the end of this story, he says, any two boys of 17, any day of the week, will go out and get you half a dozen large octopus merely for the fun of it. Here lies the whole point of the story. The hunt is, in the most literal sense, nothing but child's play to the Gilbertese. And in the book, he'd gone through and talked about how he was taken out on the reef and for octopus hunting, and that it's done in pairs because one person is the bait and the other is the hunter. And he talks about the experience, and it sounds terrifying. And by bait, it's not like you're just sticking your arm down or anything like that. These are large octopi, and the story is just wild. I highly suggest checking out the book almost just for that story. It's one of many fascinating ones. But I heard that and I was just like, man, I cannot imagine doing that. And I think part of him doing that, right, was to be a part and to show that he could do it. But for him as a grown man, it was so hard and terrifying. And he's like, this is just literally child's play to them, that, teenagers go out and do this for fun. He also talks about getting tattooed, and he did it, and again, this was probably about 100 years ago now, and it's a flat splinter of bone, about 1/4 of an inch long, and then they go over it many times. So like they would go down the arm, I believe he got both arms, and so go do it, and then, okay, well, you start over and go back over the same things. And speaking of the ancestor worship, I believe, the flat splinter bone used, it was about 1/4 of an inch long, broad, and 1.5 inches long. And it had been made from the shin bone of the grandfather of the man who was doing the tattooing. So interesting additions to the story. Magic factors in as far as the people who lived on the islands and their belief in magic, or it's a mixture of that, and it factors into the stories. And again, I don't want to spoil anything, but if you're interested in that aspect of what people believed in, how that factored into their lives, there's definitely some of that. He talks about it, how he had to either work around, or how that influenced and affected things, and how that could negatively affect the people there, and kind of how that all worked. I think disease was something that I didn't think about a lot going into this book, and he talks about the things that constantly would just kind of sweep through them, and that it would not be uncommon to be laid up for a week or two with various diseases that came through, and to think that was normal. It's just a different way of viewing things, and and how they had to deal with that at times they just didn't have anything. There was maybe one doctor in the island chain, and maybe the doctor was available, but maybe it's stormy, maybe they're called away. And something that I think I'll touch on here in a bit is the separation, and how alone they truly were. And this really kind of stamps on it, puts the stamp on it of how far it is when they would just be like, well, we didn't have the doctor, so we tried to do things ourselves. But they didn't have at the time much any way or any refrigeration, things like that. Chapter breakdown, not so important. This is for an autobiography. It's just talking through time of his experiences there in a pretty chronological method. So as far as learning here, I think, like I mentioned about the Kiribati people, the traditions, how things were, it's a snapshot to me. It's not like this is how they were all the time in all islands. It's the islands he was on, the people he was around, and through his eyes as an English administrator. But I think that for me, it was really interesting, and I like these where it's very personal. It's not, here's a overview of every single thing in the islands. It's just through their eyes and what they saw. And I find that to be really interesting. And like I said, yes, I did touch on this, but how distant they were, how long everything took back then when they traveled by ship. And the trip out from England, and then I believe once they went home when they had their children, and talking about how long it took to get back, and some of the trials and tribulations that they went through just to do that, and on very little money. They weren't paid much. And so they talk about that, and just the what we would consider to be some pretty extreme hardships that they went through, just for some regular things, even waiting for ships, maybe travel from Australia. It might be months or once a year. And so think about planning your household around that, and having to put in an order for a long time in advance, and after you get that, you won't see or have the opportunity to resupply 6 months a year, something like that. So I think that if you're interested in these snapshots, if you like the autobiographical kind of method, I found it to be really well written. It's an interesting read. It covers a lot of different areas as far as, touching on the magic, the hunting, conflicts, what it was like to be the new person, how things changed over time. I think if you're interested in that and you're interested in Kiribati and the islands and how that worked, that this would be a great read. So I really enjoyed it. Highly recommend, searching the library and grabbing a copy and checking it out.